Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Patrick Dupre Quigley. I am the artistic director and founder of Seraphic Fire, and you are here tonight to listen to a fascinating discussion about the Romantic period as part of our 22nd season, Music History 101. We have this year decided to bring in some of uh, the most exciting and dynamic scholars from around the country to talk to you a little bit about the music that you're going to hear in a few weeks from Seraphic Fire. This is a special lecture that is associated with the first week of our Enlightenment Festival. And in that festival, we will be dedicating 1 week to Romantic music. And we have as a special guest tonight and special host someone that you all know and love very well, Dr. James Bass, who has been with Seraphic Fire since the very first season. We will have questions at the end of this program, and so I would ask that you think about things throughout the evening. And if you want to send those questions directly to the account that says Seraphic Fire, or just put them into the chat, either way, we will collect those and we will compile, depending on how much time we have left at the end of the show, we will compile those and we will put them together for questions to answer. Also, please indicate whether or not you would like to ask this question or if you would like our host, James Bass, to ask this question. We would love to hear your voice, but we also know that some people are shy. This lecture is being recorded both for YouTube and for the Seraphic Saturday podcast. And you should feel free. This will be out, I think, on YouTube by tomorrow, and it will be on the Seraphic Saturday podcast within 10 days from now. So I really do encourage you that if you are interested and you find this an interesting discussion, not only to share it with your friends, but also share it with your enemies. So it's so nice to see you here. And tonight I would like to introduce and hand over our program tonight to a dear friend, an incredible scholar of Romantic music, particularly the music of Gustav Mahler. It's on his license plate even, and someone who has taught me why we should love Romantic music. Please welcome tonight our dear friend and Seraphic Fire family member, one of the founding season members of Seraphic Fire, Dr. James K. Bass. James, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick, so much for that warm welcome, and welcome to everyone tonight for this, I hope, exciting conversation about music that you may or may not know. And for those of you that do not know me, I serve as the associate conductor for Seraphic Fire and have sung with the group since the first season, as Patrick alluded earlier. And this is my first time actually conducting a portion of the Enlightenment Festival. And I'm certain, as Patrick just said, that I was selected for this week because I have had a lifelong love and passion and interest in the music of the Romantic era, including Gustav Mahler probably at the top, but so many others, Brahms and Schumann and Schubert, composers that we will talk about today. Right now, I would like to take a moment to introduce our very special guest. We're super fortunate to have his expertise and to have him with us today. And I want to give you a little information about him. Dr. Andrew Weaver is on the faculty at the Catholic University of America, and he is a specialist in the music of the 17th and 19th centuries, particularly in Austria, Germany, and Italy. He's also published on the music of the Renaissance period, and he has specific research interests, which include sacred music, court patronage, especially the Habsburgs, and that would be perfect for the Austrians, right? Music and politics with a focus on diplomacy, monarchical representation, early modern print culture, 17th century Italian opera, the Romantic lead and song cycles, especially those of Mendelssohn and Strauss. So he is well versed in this era. In addition to that, Professor Weaver has served as the secretary of the Society for 17th Century Music and as a member of the Council of the American Musicological Society and as chair of the AMS Capital Chapter. We are, in fact, in the midst of an expert on this field. So, Andrew, and if we may call you Andy, welcome to our program tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, let's go ahead and get started. And I think what would be best, probably for all of us listening today, is to have some baseline knowledge about the era in general. But the term romantic, what are the types of things that changed in the musicological world that we eventually notated this as a period?
Yeah, the Romantic period is it's a very significant period. It's actually the first period. We have period names, Renaissance, Baroque, etc. Romantic is the first one that actually was used by the people to whom it refers at the time. So people who were in the Romantic era called themselves Romantics, which would have never been the case before. And really, Romantic music is so important because it's during the Romantic era that a lot of really big ideas about music that are still around today really took hold. Ideas that for many people seem to be sort of eternal truths about music, but really only emerged in the Romantic era. So, for example, in the Romantic era, it was the first time that music was really considered personal expression, that composers were expressing themselves, that performers were able to express themselves through music. That didn't really exist before the Romantic era. Also, the idea that music, even instrumental music, can have deep meaning beyond the words. That even when you're setting vocal music, when you're setting words, the music can add something to that, and there's meaning and depth to an art form that is otherwise not representational. And then another important idea is the idea that music exists in sort of an elevated plane, above our everyday life, above our ordinary existence. That music is a means by which we can glimpse the spiritual or just glimpse, the another world beyond what, we experience in our everyday lives. For the last idea, I don't know if many people adhere to that now, but I know certainly when I was a teenager deciding that I was going to go into music, it was because music was personal expression. It was because music was so meaningful. And that's something I always thought was always was true, but it's only really during the Romantic era. And I could go on at length about what Romanticism is and why this happened, but I don't know if the audience wants me to go into great philosophical detail about Romanticism. I'll just say that, the way this affected music and the thing that makes me love Romantic music is that, because music became personal expression, it's really during the Romantic era that originality became a major requirement for works. That composers, because music now means something, composers had to say new things with their music. They couldn't just rehash things that they had done before. They wanted to make sure that their music sounded different, that their music was unique. Their music went beyond the expected and didn't follow the conventions that had really taken hold by the end of the 18th century. And the way this comes across to us listening to Romantic music today is that because composers were trying so hard to be original, this meant that their music became very complex and very rich, that composers were exploring new things in all the parameters of music. So the harmonies get much more complex, much richer, unusual chord progressions, going to unusual keys, the melodic lines but become much longer and not as predictable as say a Mozart melody. The melodies are something that we can sort of get lost in, as the composer is saying something. In terms of orchestral music, the orchestra gets bigger. New instruments emerge. The sounds just get bigger. Even the piano gets bigger, and composers are able to do more and express more. And this is to me is the sort of the essence of Romantic music, but it's all done in a way that's very accessible and communicative because Romantics, they wanted to reach listeners. They wanted to say important things to the listeners. So unlike say 20th century music, which is also very complex and very rich, but often in an off-putting or not very accessible way. Romantic music to this day is still music that we can just sort of wrap ourselves in and really get lost in and love. At least I do.
Absolutely. And if you have seen any major orchestral series for a year of programming, romantic music holds still the most prominent seat in that programming. It still resonates with so many of us. And as you mentioned, the expansion of the orchestra, let's use that instrument first, was paramount to the experience. The invention of these new instruments, the inclusion of many more first time percussion instruments that had not been really used in this idiom. The saxophone was invented during this era. It was an era of exploration in many ways. Sonic universes were being created. And I use that term because Mahler discussed that. He wanted his symphonic works to encompass, he called worlds, world building. They talk about that now in video games, to world build and to create atmospheres. He was trying to do it with sounds by adding mandolins to the orchestra or a bundle of sticks tied together, all kinds of amazing sounds that were evocative of nature or individual spiritual journeys. And the music became much more, in my opinion, and I want to talk a little bit about choral music specifically here in a second. It became much more. It allowed many more areas of exploration as far as subject matters. For example, in the choral world, and of course, meaning so much to us in Seraphic Fire, prior to this period, if you were to sing in a choir or sing a choral work, most often, and this is a generalization, the texts would come from either biblical religious texts or maybe some high poetry, some what would be considered elevated poetry. When we get to the second half of the 19th century, there are many more types of influences of what type of text could be used. We still would have high poetry, but then there would be books on philosophy that would be set to music. There were personal letters and correspondences between people that became set to music. Folk ideas. It was really just an explosion of thought, idea, and of course, ultimately for us as listeners, musical experiences. So for programming the concert that Seraphic Fire is about to sing here in just a few weeks, I wanted to try to honor our mission. And one of our mission statements talks about performing those works that are either rare or underperformed. Now, if you were to look at the names of the composers for this upcoming program, you would recognize, I would say, almost all of them as an audience, probably. But several of the works selected are works that may not have been performed as often as other works. And I wanted us to be able to explore that. A pair of composers that we're going to look at in the program is Robert and Clara Schumann. These were really kind of monolithic characters in this period. And I was hoping, Andy, you could talk to us a little bit about them together and separately and their impact.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, yes, they were monumental figures without a question. But what's really interesting is that while today we think of them primarily for their music, that they were composers, and yes, they were both composers, but at the time, their music was not the thing they were both best known for. They're actually known for other contributions to the musical world. So Robert Schumann, his biggest contribution, his biggest legacy during his lifetime was actually as a critic, as a writer about music. This was really his main source of income. This was really how he established himself in the musical world. And he came from a literary background. His father was a bookseller and publisher, so he was immersed in romantic literature his whole life, and that's how he wrote. His journalism is really, it's a lot of fun to read most of the time, when he wasn't trying to be too academic. But for the most part, it reads like romantic literature. He speaks through characters. He has pseudonyms for himself and for people in his life. He had a whole society that he created and wrote through. And what's interesting about his journalism is that he was really writing for everybody. Musical journalism was not new in the 19th century, but in the 18th century, it was for specialists. It was musicians writing for other musicians and talking about very detailed analytical things. But Schumann was writing for the general public. He was really trying to educate the public, to build audience members, to create an appreciation for romantic music. And this, as I said, this is what he was most known for. He founded his own journal. It's called the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, the New Journal for Music, a journal that still exists, is still being published to this day. He was the editor-in-chief for about 10 years. And this was, as I said, this was, the main way that he interacted with the public and that most people knew him. So whereas he was very much known as a writer about music, Clara Schumann, on the other hand, was known as a performer. She was a pianist. She was one of the most famous pianists of the 19th century. She was without question the most famous woman pianist of the 19th century, but of all the pianists of the 19th century, certainly Franz Liszt was number one, but Clara was not that far behind Franz Liszt. She performed her entire life. She gave her first concert when she was 9 years old, and she performed during her courtship with Robert. She performed right after they were married. After he died, she was alive for about 40 years after he died, and she performed up until the end, and really was known as the high priestess. Actually, that was a name people used for her, because by the she had a very serious approach to music and performed. She was a huge champion of Robert's music, but also a champion of other new musics. She played Beethoven, she played older composers, and really was hugely popular, and not only as a performer but as a pedagogue. In I can't think of the year offhand, but when she, about 20 years after Schumann died, she was appointed the principal piano teacher at the conservatory in Frankfurt, and really created a huge legacy as a pedagogue, for future generations of pianists. And of course they both composed. I mean, Robert always wanted to compose. He is another, going back to Robert, what's interesting is that he was not raised to be a musician at all. He did not come from a musical family. His parents wanted him to be a lawyer. His father died before he was done with what we consider high school, and put in his will that if Robert wanted his inheritance, he needed to go to college. And his mom wanted him to go to law school, so he went to law school, but he decided early on that, you know what, I want to be a musician. And he first wanted to be a pianist. And how he met Clara is that he studied with her father. He actually lived in their house. He was 20 years old when he started studying. She was about 10 years younger than he was. So she was 11 years old. And so the romance didn't happen right away. In fact, he was engaged to someone else for a time. And then eventually her father was absolutely opposed to them getting married and fought them in court. But they won. And this marriage is one of the most famous marriages in all of music history, because they were each other's muses, and he supported her composition. She, was a prolific composer. She wrote about 100 pieces. She published her music during her lifetime. Interestingly, she stopped composing when Robert died and just focused on performing from that point forward. But yeah, I could go on and on, but I probably shouldn't, so I'll just leave it there.
It's always fascinating to hear those inner kind of life stories that we don't know about some of these composers. One of the great things about the Romantic era as well is that we began to start to know more about these composers' personal lives. It became more of a thing for people to notate and to remember and to save journals and letters. As we now look back, it gives us a much better insight on what they were like as people, in addition to representing themselves in their music, as you were referring to earlier, as a kind of large aspect of the Romanticism. I find it remarkable about Clara that as a performer, as you mentioned, she was essentially a superstar and performing in the capitals of Europe as a woman.
Hmm.
And this is to be noted that this is not common in the era, right? It is not common. It is still a very kind of male dominated genre. Orchestras did not have female players generally. And so for her to be on the faculty at a major conservatory and to also be invited by heads of state to come and perform the biggest and best works of the day must have spoken or speaks to her ability as a performer, wouldn't you think?
Yes, oh, absolutely. It did help that she was playing the piano. The piano was, an instrument that was appropriate for women. So I think that certainly helps. It would have been shocking if she would have been, a brass player or even a string player. But the piano helps. But you're absolutely right. It really speaks to just how remarkable of a performer she must have been from a young age, and the fact that she could continue in it. Because there were other, I'm thinking just briefly of Mozart and his sister, who, their father took both of them out performing, but she eventually aged out and was no longer performing. But Clara, she really made that impression early on and was able to sort of to buck the trend and get the respect and good reviews that allowed her to keep performing.
Yeah, and Robert had a relatively tragic ending of his life, and went through a very, very dark period. And I don't know if you want to say just a little bit about that before we get into our next composer, but it is well documented and affected him and many others around him.
Yes. So basically, towards the end of his life, Robert attempted suicide. There's debate among scholars as to what extent he had mental issues throughout his life. For the longest time, the lore was that he was basically just crazy his whole life and just went up and down. It certainly seems undeniable that he must have been bipolar. I think there's no question that he was bipolar. But a lot of scholars these days are thinking that maybe yes, he did have big bouts of depression, but it really wasn't until the very end that his mind really started to go. And it really seems to have been primarily because he had syphilis. He seems to have acquired syphilis even before he met Clara. And, when you have syphilis for a really long time, it eventually attacks your nervous system. And that's what happened. But yeah, he ended his life in an asylum. Clara couldn't even see him when he was in the asylum, but they still did write to each other. And yeah, I mean, Clara's life, not only was she this amazing pianist and traveled all over the world, but she did have a husband who was mentally ill, at least towards the end of his life. She had kids, eight kids. And most of them lived into adulthood. Only one of them died in infancy. And she was doing all of this. And it boggles the mind, really, how much she was able to accomplish and make of her life.
I have great admiration for her, and I'm so looking forward to conducting a couple of her works on this upcoming program. Abendfeier in Venedig, this is a piece that she wrote, double chorus, and these are miniatures. Almost all the program piece on this program will be miniatures, but I believe that the quality of the piece stands right up to the work of Robert. Neither one are more or less, but they are at least equals. So the next composer I would like to talk about, and it's related to these two and in a very interesting way, is Johannes Brahms. This is a name that even a casual listener to classical music generally knows. He was also an enormous figure during this time period. There was a bifurcation of stylisms of composition, especially in the Germanic speaking lands. Think on one side, the composers like Wagner and Liszt. And then there was another side. There was this side that was essentially a little bit more conservative in its practice, but with great idealism. And Brahms eventually became the kind of head of that. But Robert Schumann would have been considered in that, of course, Mendelssohn prior to them. So talk a little bit about Brahms and his unique relationship with the Schumanns who we were just discussing.
Right. Yes. Brahms Absolutely. It was a very unique relationship. In many ways, Brahms owed his career to Robert Schumann. Brahms was did not come from means. He came from Hamburg, his from a lower class family, didn't have a stellar education. The one of the stories about Brahms is that in order to help support his family, he was playing in brothels, when he was a kid. Most people have discredited that, but it's still one of those stories that people tell. And so there's nothing really indicating that this is someone who was going to be famous and great. But when he was 20 years old in 1853, he was introduced to the Schumanns. And Robert immediately recognized that there was something here. And in that same year, 1853, Robert published what was going to be his last published article in which he introduced Brahms to the world. The article is called New Paths, and he really presents Brahms as a messiah. And in order to understand this, it's important, it's important for me to say that one of the sort of through lines of Schumann's criticism is that he spent his entire career basically looking for the next Beethoven. This was, Beethoven in the early 19th century, he was the god of music, especially the god of German music. And when he died in 1827, there was very much a hole that was left for especially the composers like Robert Schumann, who was born in 1810. So he was just coming of age when Beethoven died. And all of the musicians at this time, all of the composers were really vying to see, which one of us is going to do what Beethoven did, which one of us is going to push music forward, do new things, take us into the next golden age of music. And there were other composers who claimed this for themselves. Franz Liszt claimed that he was the next Beethoven. Richard Wagner absolutely claimed that he was the next Beethoven. But, Schumann didn't buy into that. That's that other camp that you were just talking about. But Schumann was constantly evaluating the newest composers and really seeing, is this the one? For a time, he thought Chopin might be the next Beethoven, but then he got really frustrated because Chopin just kept writing little piano miniatures and wasn't writing a big symphony. He thought Berlioz might be the next Beethoven. He loved Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, one of his most in-depth, detailed, boring articles is about this detailed analysis of that work. But Berlioz disappointed him. So it was towards the end of he was towards the end of his life, and he hadn't found the next Beethoven. And then he met Brahms. Brahms, who was 20 years old, had never written anything. He'd only written piano music and some songs. And yet Schumann was like, here he is. Here he is. He's emerging like Minerva, fully formed out of the head of Jupiter. And the chosen one. I mean, he literally uses the phrase, here is the chosen one. So this, clearly put Brahms on the map. And certainly Brahms was intimidated by this. Brahms, who, as I said, hadn't written anything for orchestra yet, and started working on his first symphony a couple years later, but didn't actually finish his first symphony until 20 years later, when he was in his 40s, is when the first symphony premiered, because of all this pressure that Schumann had put on him. And Brahms, was always seems to have been a little insecure. He confided in friends and sent them pieces and said, "What do you think of this? Is this good enough?" But he also really took it seriously. That Schumann was crowning him the successor and the successor of this particular school of music, the Beethovenian tradition. The tradition that Schumann was a part of, and it's clear that Brahms saw Schumann as such an important mentor and really honored that throughout his career. And when Robert Schumann died, Brahms was there for Clara. He moved in actually for a little bit just to help her get on her feet. And the big question that has launched 1,000 rumors is what actually was the relationship between Clara and Brahms. You know, Did they have a romantic affair? Some people will say yes. I don't think so. I think Brahms revered Schumann too much that he wouldn't do that to his bride. I don't think Clara was looking for anything romantic after losing, her soulmate. But they had a very, very close relationship throughout the rest of Clara's life. And she was an important mentor as well. He sent her music and valued her opinion, and well, didn't always follow her advice, but still, this is, I think, a big reason why he was so against the Richard Wagners and the Franz Liszt, because they were moving ahead in brand new directions. They saw a whole other path that German music needed to follow, and Brahms was very committed to really including the whole German past in his own music and really honoring the German tradition while, as you said, doing new things. I mean, by the end of his life, yes, he was the bastion of conservatism. This by the time Mahler and Richard Strauss were on the scene, Brahms was sort of the old institution, old-fashioned one. But during most of his life, he was just as cutting edge as the others, just in a very different way.
I will say this, for the brief time that Brahms and Mahler did intersect, Brahms said he picked Mahler over Strauss as to the music that he preferred. And I have a couple things I'd like to share with our audience as well. In full disclosure, my doctoral dissertation was on Johannes Brahms, so I have a keen interest and love of his music and as him as a person, and I feel indebted to Brahms because he's the reason I have a doctoral degree. But there were the article to which you referred, Andy, the Neue Bahnen, or new paths. This article, I implore all of you, our friends and listeners that are here, to go and actually, you can find it on the internet, it's very easy, and read a translation. It's remarkable in many ways of how prophetic this article was about a 20-year-old kid from Hamburg who had highest education, was his piano teacher. And it almost all came true. There was a lot of very kind of luxurious wording in some places, but for a person that might have been mentally unstable, we're not sure, he certainly understood the talent that was latent in Brahms. And in a true Germanic sense, I believe that Brahms felt absolutely loyal and indebted to him, as you mentioned, for the rest of his life. And Clara and Johannes did have a relationship that went long, many, many years. And you can read the letters that were extant, they're published, and you can make a decision yourself as to whether or not you think it was more than platonic or something else. But their relationship was, at the very least, really actually good friends. And I have a couple stories I'd love to share with you if I'm allowed. So Clara and Brahms at times would play piano duets. That was a big thing that people would do at the time. Everyone was beginning to have a piano in their home. It was considered a very right and proper thing to do with your leisure time. And a lot of these major works would be created in these piano editions that you could play at home with you or your friends. It was what people did. And Clara wrote in one of her journal entries that she actually hated playing with Brahms. She said, I will never tell him, but she said, I hated playing with him because he would so unexpectedly and erratically change tempos. She said, I just didn't know which way was up or down. I'm paraphrasing. Now, as a person that interprets the music of Brahms, that is actually very good information because it shows that Brahms had a sense of time or the beat being extremely flexible in music, which was a little, that is very much in the Romantic idea, but a little less conservative. So it shows he did have some progressive thought about music making. And when Brahms was emerging as a professional musician, he actually did a lot of conducting, which was remarkable at that time. There weren't many conductors. And he ended up back in Hamburg for a little bit. He wasn't quite sure where he's going to end up. He really wanted this job in Hamburg to conduct the orchestra there, but he was very inexperienced and young and actually completely out of his mind to think he was going to get this job. But keep that in your head because I'm going to come back to that part. He really thought he wanted the Hamburg orchestra job and he deserved it. In the meantime, he was asked to prepare a group of sopranos and altos, a treble choir, essentially for a wedding. And he did. And they loved it so much, they asked him, the ladies in the choir said, hey, can we do this on a regular basis? We'd like to keep doing this. So they decided to found the Hamburger Frauenchor, a Damenchor, a choir of women that would meet about once a month, and they had to copy their own parts into their part book. And there's a wonderful set of stories there. But what I find most remarkable is that on one of the registers for the attendance, which was required at these rehearsals, one of the signatures was Clara Schumann. So she actually went to Hamburg and visited and sang in the choir with him. I mean, this is just it. Kind of my little heart got so warm when I thought about that with he and Clara. And then the final Brahms, I could tell Brahms stories all night, but connecting Brahms to Beethoven to Schumann, which is so important. I think, Andy, you're helping us draw this line through this music. The specter of Beethoven, it goes all the way into Mahler. Mahler also was extremely reverent of Beethoven and copies models of Beethoven into the 20th century. Brahms, as Andy alluded to, took forever to write this first symphony. And in his composition room, in his apartment in Vienna, where he eventually ended up for 33 years, he had a bust of Beethoven and a bust of Bismarck. Bismarck, of course, a major, at that time, Prussian German character. And he had them over his desk. And he once mentioned, he says, well, it's difficult for me to work knowing that Beethoven is there looking down on me. And
Yes.
right, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Well, there's also another very famous quote. He says, "You cannot imagine how it feels to hear continually the marching of a giant behind you." So it's the same basic idea. Yeah.
And when Brahms eventually did write that amazing first symphony, there are lots of parallels to Beethoven, especially in that last movement. So for our set of performances, I have selected one set of pieces by Brahms rather than separate works. We're going to do his entire Opus 92. And just to give you a perspective, that's in the last third of his life, as far as chronologically. And it's a set of 4 works for quartet, it says, and piano. That's another wonderful aspect of the Romantic era, is that the idea of piano accompaniment with the choirs in art pieces became much more common and prevalent. And you get a composer like Brahms, who is an excellent composer for the piano and a solid pianist himself, writing for that instrument plus the choir, essentially a match made in heaven. So this Opus 92 set contains one of the pieces that many of you might know, O schöne Nacht, O beautiful night. And this piece is often excerpted and just done by itself, but we're going to do the entire set. And you're going to see how Brahms treats these 4 texts with the incredible accompaniment that he has written for the piano. They are masterpieces, and I don't think that Seraphic Fire has ever done the entire set. So this will be a first for Seraphic, and I hope that you all will get to hear them. Okay, so now another kind of pairing on this concert features the composers Felix and Fanny Mendelssohn. So Andy, first, who were they? And a lot of people are not as aware of Fanny as they are of Felix. So why should we know about Fanny?
Yeah. Good question. I will say, Felix Mendelssohn was one of the biggest, most well-known musicians of his day, whereas Robert Schumann was not really necessarily known as well for his compositions. Felix Mendelssohn was. He really was, by the end of his life, really revered as a major figure in the German musical world. And the background of Felix and his sister Fanny is very different from the other composers we've talked about. We've mentioned, Brahms was was low class. Robert Schumann came from working class. His father was a bookseller. Clara Schumann also not, you know, not super high class. Her father was a musician, was a pianist. But the Mendelssohn family was in high society, shall we say. The grandfather of Felix and Fanny was a very, very prominent, very famous philosopher, a Jewish philosopher, Moses Mendelssohn. And so the family, it was a very, very respectable family, and therefore Felix and Fanny grew up with a lot of benefits, a lot of privileges, and they both, as was common for upper class children, they had very solid musical educations, and it became clear very early on that Felix was a prodigy. Felix probably wrote more music as a kid than Mozart did. We think of Mozart as the archetypal child prodigy churning out lots of music. Well, Felix Mendelssohn was churning out probably even more. One of his most famous orchestral pieces, the Overture to Midsummer's Night Dream, he was 16 when he wrote that. There's other works that he was a teenager that are major staples of the chamber music literature, his octet, for example. So because he clearly was a very talented musician, he decided to pursue music. He probably didn't have to, but this was a decision he made. But because he also came from money, he had a lot of privileges. He was able to take the grand tour to Italy, early on and really soak up a lot of of Italian musical culture. His Italian symphony is sort of his souvenir from his travels to Italy. So he came from, from a position where he was able to start making contributions to the musical world very early on. He was, quite well known as a conductor, as a composer, and held some very prominent positions in his life. And then there's Fanny, his sister, his older sister. She was the older of the two siblings. She also was very, very clearly very talented, the way Felix was. But as a woman in an upper class family, music was not necessarily an option for her. Her father, in fact, very clearly told her, there's a letter in which her father says, perhaps Felix can go on and have a musical career, but not you. It's not that's not the life that you should have. So, she chose, to have a domestic life. She got married, she had a son, but she never stopped her musical life. She is, without question, the most prolific female composer of the 19th century. She wrote over 450 pieces of music. Clara Schumann didn't even write 100 pieces of music. So she has a huge amount of music, but it was all done for most of it was done privately. And she hosted salons. She was very well known for she had a regular Sunday salon where she would basically give concerts. She eventually started her own choir. You mentioned, Brahms was directing a choir. She started her own choir, just amateur choir, just to sing music together. And in the lore of Fanny Mendelssohn, for the longest time, it was really emphasized how her career was suppressed, that she was told you can't do this. And Felix often came under fire because there's one letter he wrote to his mom, not to her, to his mom, where he's like, I'm not really sure if Fanny should publish. He does say if she does publish her music, I will support her, absolutely. But still, it's often been seen that, in the patriarchal culture of the 19th century, she was beat down and wasn't allowed to have a musical life. And while yes, patriarchal culture, and it was seen as inappropriate, but she still, from all accounts, had a very happy life, was very happily married, and indulged in all of her musical pursuits. And by the time she decided, maybe I want to publish my music, she did. The last year of her life, she finally made the decision, I'm going to start publishing my music. And both she and Felix died very young. Actually, they died the same year. So she probably would have published a lot more. She published, I think, 11 published opuses of music. Um, but she left a huge amount of music that we're still discovering today. Where people are still getting to know this, but there isn't a clunker among them. She was an amazing composer, writing not just solo piano music, not just songs. Those are sort of the typical genres that women would often compose in, including Clara Schumann, wrote primarily solo piano music and songs, but she wrote chamber music, some very ambitious chamber music. And absolutely, I'm delighted that you are including some of her music on this concert because her music needs to be known more because, yeah, she's a phenomenal composer.
And I realized as I was going through the process of programming this concert, which I've actually discussed this many times with lots of our listeners, it's a lot of work for conductors when programming concerts that aren't just a single work. If it's the Mozart Requiem, we know it's the Mozart Requiem, right? But when you're trying to put together maybe miniatures like this, it takes a lot of effort to put a program together. And I realized when getting into the music of Fanny Mendelssohn that what you just said was tremendously true. I just didn't know anything really. Only a couple pieces of hers years ago. And as a person that intersects with music literally daily in my life, how is it that I've missed this remarkable woman? We're going to sing two really beautiful and amazing miniatures of hers, but we're going to start our set of music with hers by a piece called Schilflied, which is just sublime in the actual definition of that word. I'm very excited about it. But for Felix, at Seraphic Fire, we joke amongst ourselves as singers and conductors, and Patrick has said this many times, that kind of our patron saint composer, Seraphic Fire, is Tomás Luis de Victoria. We sing so much or have sung so much of his music, and it's so appropriate for our type of ensemble. We don't sing the romantic repertoire as often, sometimes because of the size of the ensembles, sometimes for other reasons. We've done Brahms, so we love Brahms, but we have sung Mendelssohn many times. His a cappella motets, Felix Mendelssohn that is, are pieces that we've come back to. There is one motet that will be on this program that Seraphic Fire has never sung. And for me personally, it is a desert island piece. A deserted island piece. This is one of the 10 pieces, if I was told you could only have 10, take them with you, which means I would have to jettison one of the Mahler symphonies. So I'm making a sacrifice to get to this. This motet is expansive. It will be a real test and a reach for Seraphic Fire. It's called Mitten wir in Leben sind. And it involves texts from one of the antiphons of the church and then Martin Luther. It is written, like many of Felix Mendelssohn's a cappella motets, for double choir. And in this case, it's double choir in the treble voices, and then the men's voices are acting independently most of the time and then come together to create this glorious, incredibly expansive symphonic sound for the choir. The text, Mitten wir in Leben sind, basically says, here in the middle of my life or our lives, we're surrounded by death, we're surrounded by strife. Who is here to protect us? And then the other choir responds, it is only you, you alone, Lord. And the music continues to expand on these verses. It's 7.5 minutes long. That is as long as a movement of Haydn symphony. It's as long as some of the movements of middle period Mozart symphony. So this is a substantial work that we're going to put forward, and I can't wait for our listeners to hear it. And if you're not going to the concert, look this piece up by Felix Mendelssohn, Mitten wir in Leben sind. Okay, there's another composer on this program that Seraphic has intersected with a few times, but a lot of our listeners may not know this composer, although there's been a lovely revival of his music recently, and I think many of us are celebrating that. So this is the composer Samuel Coleridge Taylor, and talk to us a little bit about the uniqueness of this man.
Yeah, Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He's a very special, and a unique man. He was very, very famous in his lifetime. He was British, so he was born in London, spent most of his career in London, and he was Black. but had an amazing career, a career that, would be the envy, an envy for most people. He studied music at the Royal College of Music. He studied violin and composition. By the time he was 16, he was publishing his music. By the time he was 20, he had written his first symphony. Brahms took twice that long. He eventually became a professor of composition at the Guildhall School of Music in London. He was well known as a conductor. He was sometimes called the African Mahler. So he, compared favorably to Mahler, who was absolutely probably the most prominent composer, not composer, conductor at the end of the 19th century. And he did all of this, as I said, as a Black man. And what really makes him special is that not only did he have the success, but he really saw it as his mission in life to establish the dignity of Black people. He really was a pioneer for civil rights at a time when many Black people, including him, were facing horrible discrimination and horrible obstacles in their way. And this is probably his biggest legacy today. He is among the major late 19th century Black pioneers, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass. These are people that inspired him, that influenced him, and that he in turn influenced as well. So this is a major part of his legacy, especially in the US. He took 3 trips to the United States. He went on concert tours in the United States. He was invited to the White House by Teddy Roosevelt. And there was actually a choir that formed in Washington, D.C., the Coleridge Taylor Choral Society, inspired by him, that when he went, I think they actually sponsored one of his trips. So he toured with them and conducted them and really was a major inspiration for many, many, many Black people at the turn of the 20th century.
It's a fascinating story. It truly is. And his music is remarkable. Seraphic Fire has performed his work Seadrift a couple of times in recent years. Patrick is a proponent of his music, as I am now as well. But we're going to be singing a piece of his called Whispers of Summer. And it is just deeply romantic in every sense of the word. It would be the perfect Valentine's Day piece. If you were needing a Valentine's Day piece, Whispers of Summer is talking about nostalgia and love and nature. And it has an incredibly attractive, sentimental sound to it. The way he uses the harmonies in this particular work are very sentimental. And in comparison, I'm doing a work here in Los Angeles of his called his Te Deum for organ and chorus, and completely different style, and feels very monarchical, a kind of ceremonial music. So it shows the width and range of this composer. And of course, he wrote great romantic orchestral works. He was very versed in his compositional practice. So I'm glad that we're going to get a chance to share this piece, Whispers of Summer, with our listeners, which I know Seraphic Fire has also never performed. A lot of first times on this program, although romantic music has been around for a long time. So I want to loop back and tell a couple anecdotal stories now. And if any of you have any questions, this might be the time to start formulating them. This is a couple stories about Brahms. We thought, podcasts and town halls and these kind of interactions that we're having today, they should be fun as well as informational. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about Brahms' insecurity, because Andy mentioned that when he was talking about Brahms, that he was an insecure composer. And Andy, certainly jump in here anytime, but I have 2 stories for you. One has to do with when Brahms was a very, very young man. He was a teenager, and his parents sent him to another town, essentially, to stay the summer with some relatives, essentially the 19th century equivalent of send them to the grandparents so we can have some time off from the kids, right? So he goes to this town, and the town was called Winsen, Winsen. And while he was there, he met a young girl that they became friends. There was no kind of romance. I think she was 15 or 14 and he was maybe 15 or 16. So these are just young adults. And while Brahms was in this town of Vincent, there was a men's choral society that would gather and sing kind of, fun songs at the local gathering water hole. So there would have been beer flowing and they had a billiard table. There was a pool table and it's described. And this was men only. So Brahms was kind of there with them. And they asked him, this choral society said, hey, will you conduct us or kind of lead us? You seem to have some musical talent. So he did. He led them through these rehearsals and songs, and he wrote a couple of songs for this group. One was on the ABCs, one was on something else. So they kind of sang some music of his. So he tells this to his friend, her name is Lichten, and at the end of their time together, there was 2 summers there, he gave her these little manuscripts of this music. He said, oh, it's a little gift, a little memento. So fast forward now 30 something years, and Brahms has composed the entirety of his Requiem, which during his lifetime actually is probably his most performed work. And it was starting to make its rounds, and his publisher was saying, hey, we need to kind of get the formalized edition. Let's get this reprinted. And Brahms wrote a letter to his friend, to Lichten, and said, my publisher is wanting to kind of do a complete publication of my works. Will you please send me those 2 little manuscripts that I gave you all those years ago? And I'll send them back. And of course, she did. She sent them to him. Well, he promptly destroyed them. And he sent her, instead, a beautiful leather-bound signed copy of the Requiem, which at the time was the most famous work of Brahms. She was furious and wrote a letter to him basically saying, how dare you? These meant so much to me. This was a memento of that time and of my friendship with you. And she really interrogated him, wanting an answer. He wrote back and he apologized and said, but you have to know that the world cannot see those early fumblings and mistakes of a composer. He was already thinking about the insecurity of people judging him on that piece. So that was the first one, and here's the second story. Brahms wrote 2 piano concertos. Most people don't even know that. The first concerto is not nearly as popular as the second concerto, and I will let you decide if the first is as strong as the second. But when he first premiered the first concerto, he did a concert in, I believe it was at Concertgebouw. And so he was young, the piece was performed, and the audience hissed, which was the European way of booing. And many, many, many years later, the orchestra was having its 50th anniversary, and now Brahms is a well-known figure. And the second concerto was an incredibly popular piece. So they asked him, we would love for you to come and perform or conduct your second piano concerto on our 50th anniversary. And he wrote back and said no. And really, at the time, didn't give much of a reason. But he wrote his friend, Joseph Joachim, and told him, and Joachim said, you're acting like a child. You need to stop this. You write them back and tell them you'll do it. So Brahms writes a letter to the Concertgebouw and he says, I will come and I will play the second piano concerto on one condition, that the first piano concerto is also on the same program because of the insult done to me so many years ago. And the orchestra agreed. And so Hans von Bülow conducted this concert, and Brahms played the first piano concerto on the first half, and then he conducted Hans von Bülow playing the second concerto on the second half. So it just gives you a little insight that Brahms was feisty in every way possible, but also had such an incredible delicacy to him and delicateness to him that appears in some of the music that we're going to do. So I think we're coming to the end of our time together today, everybody. But if anyone has any questions, now would be the time. Okay. Well, if not, I want to thank Andy, Dr. Andy, so much for being here today and being our voice of expertise and sharing so passionately. I love it. Your speech and cadence increases and speeds up in this music, and that is always a telltale sign of someone that really loves what they're talking about. Andy, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.
And for all of you that attended today and all of you that are listening, on behalf of Patrick Quigley and myself and all of us at Seraphic Fire, we're so grateful that you would take some of your time to be with us, to learn a little bit more about this incredible period of music. And of course, especially these choral works that represent this period that we're going to be sharing. Much love to you all, and look forward to seeing you hopefully in the very, very near future.